Welcome to The Social Capitalist, an interactive interview series dedicated to delivering in-depth discussions on relationship science with the best and brightest thought leaders in business and academia. Social Capitalist events are sponsored programming of myGreenlight, an exclusive online learning platform for relationship development skills and strategy. For more information or to attend a call live, visit our webpage at www.mygreenlight.com. Enjoy the recording.
Oh, fantastic to see you, Reid. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
Fantastic. Thanks a lot for joining us, and I'm excited about the conversation we're about to have. I'm sort of drawn back to the days at Renaissance Weekend, at TED, and that we've talked about the very burgeoning and now ridiculously successful business and the impact and the mark that you're making. And I just, on a personal basis, I just couldn't be prouder and happier for you. Hey, so by way of introduction, obviously you are a draw here today, so everybody knows who you are. But first of all, welcome to the Social Capitalist. I couldn't help but to tap into your LinkedIn profile just to see what other people were saying about you on your recommendations. And it was really heartwarming to see the wonderful community talking not only about your brilliant mind, your negotiating, your strategy capabilities, but what I've always noticed about you, particularly as you curate your tables at TED, sitting in one place with rotating entrepreneurs coming through seeking your advice, how wonderfully supportive you've always been. And I've also noticed along the way how you and I both agree so fully that networks aren't about connections in terms of the number of contacts, but they're about real relationships. And you have you've not only created an enabling platform for that, but you've lived it in your life, and I couldn't be happier to have you here. So thank you very much for coming, Reid.
Well, thanks, and I'll keep trying to get the lighting a little bit right. It's funny to have your face reflected. I haven't got the lighting in this breakfast nook right because I'm doing this call from my home.
Just careful not to scan down too far so we see your fuzzy pajamas and the slippers. So.
Oh yeah, none of those. I've been up for a while, but it's just trying to get the lighting right.
All right. Well, take your time.
Yep.
So the first question I had, Reid, when I heard you speak, and I read the book, of course, a while ago when it was still in galley format, what do you really think has fundamentally changed in the world that's made all of this relational enabling tools, practices, conversations come to the forefront? What's really changed? And did you realize that it changed as much as it had when you started the business? And what's changed since then? Because a lot has changed since 2002.
Well, I think the primary thing that's changed is the notion at which all industries have become accelerated by technology. It's kind of a combination of globalization. It's a combination of software and IT, invention of new technology, and that means that all the industries are moving at faster paces. They need more innovation. There's more disruptive change about anything from jobs moving to different locations to different skills being necessary, these sorts of things, companies needing to launch new products in order to adapt. And that's an accelerating force. And globalization itself actually comes from technology, both in energy, transport, IT, all these sorts of things as this happens. And so what this has done is I think this has accelerated the concept by which every person has to think of themselves as the kind of the CEO of themselves, the entrepreneur of their own life, the driving the kind of the business of their own work and of their career, even as they're, for example, an employee for their entire career, their entire work life. And I think I saw these changes coming in part because Silicon Valley has been operating this way for decades. It's part of the reason why there's been such a strong basis of innovation here. And one of the reasons why when you look at kind of global industries, each decade we do seem to be launching some new ones out of the valley because we operate this way. And it was like, well, I think this is what anything is trending to. And when I began to do research into it, even in places like Japan where, the history was, well, you work for one company your whole life, you start there after you graduate college, your average 30-year-old in Japan has had 4 jobs now, and that's 4 jobs at different companies as kind of an instance. And that's the transformation that we see happening generally in the workforce.
So let's pause there for a second. With that kind of rotation in jobs, and also the unleashing of the global world where you're thrown into teams that you've never met before and perhaps never will on a bumping bellies, personal perspective. I believe that you really need to begin to take this relationship thing to a purposeful higher level, and if you don't, you're going to be really left behind. And so you're talking about being a CEO of your own business, and I'm talking about the criticality of elevating the relational elements of that to a process, to a practice, to something that's functional and serious. Do you think those two things are certainly in play and the wind behind your back at LinkedIn today?
Definitely. I mean, I think part of the question is how do you take this, given that we don't all have a marketing department, we don't all have an R&D department, et cetera, that when we're saying we're the business of ourselves, how does that work? And the answer is your virtual company is your network. It's your set of relationships. It's the folks that you ally with as you go through life, as you work, as you progress in your work. And that being serious about this is critical if you're going to actually be serious about your work. If you're going to be serious about where you're going in your life. And so I think it's an intrinsic and fundamental relationship, because the only way that you can begin to kind of think about how to progress in your career, how to invest in yourself, how to have the right abilities and the right network in order to solve problems is if you invest in your relationships the right way, because those relationships are essentially the virtual company around you that makes everything go.
I'm gonna get to the startup of you in a moment. And by the way, the reviews have been phenomenal. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I love this one. Crammed with insights and strategies to help each of us create the work life that we want. And that's sort of what I felt when I read it myself. But before I get there, I'm sure many people here want to know what's going on for the future of LinkedIn as well. And I'm not looking in the short term. I'm really curious, what is your vision for 10 years from now as we wake up using this enabling tool, LinkedIn? How do you think it's going to impact our lives? How do you think we're going to be interacting with LinkedIn into the future? Where are you going with it?
Well, let's see. I'll start with a slightly technical description and then get a little bit more humanist. The technical description is LinkedIn is meant to be a platform by which you assemble all of the information, people, and other kinds of resources in order to help you work day by day and solve big challenges. Now, of course, some of those challenges are sometimes looking for a job or looking for an employee, but they're also, when you conceptualize what professionals do in terms of what work we do, is we solve challenges every day, every week. It's solving those problems and getting that work done, which constitutes the work that we do. And LinkedIn is leveraging your network to help assemble all that information, knowledge, the right people, bring the people together in order to convene and solve a particular problem. Now, the humanist way of doing that is, for example, one of the things that we're trying to do with LinkedIn today is, when you wake up, what's the information that you need to know in terms of what's going on in the world, because there's going to be continued exponentiation of information on the internet that's relevant to you and the job you're doing, your professional, your industry, and what's the subset that really essentially says, here is what I need to focus on today, here's what I need to know, here's where I need to go. And the elaboration of that promise is what LinkedIn is doing. And so it's kind of insights, people and information, and available with you wherever you go.
And I have to say that one of the principles in your book, which I try to embrace as an entrepreneur probably too much, is the pivoting concept. One of the things I love about you, Reid, is ever since I've met you, you've been on a very steady path, like a drumbeat, to make this business successful. And it would seem from the outside world that it was a very deliberate, very well set out plan that started and had a straight trajectory and didn't change. And at least the level-headedness with which you approached it, that's what it seemed like from the outside. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the pivoting at LinkedIn, but also the pivoting in our own lives, because what you just described is valuable information that all of us need to pivot in our own professional career lives that we'll be able to find at LinkedIn. maybe talk a little bit about this concept of pivoting and how not to think of it as peripatetic or unfocused, but instead strategic and important.
Well, so let's see. What I think is useful to have when you do a strategy, either for yourself or for a business, is to have a long-term strategy and then short-term set of tactics. And tactics are kind of how you get to various milestones along those strategies. And it's not like dominoes, because you actually may have to pivot not just in where you're moving or which tactics you're doing, but also in what your strategy is and what you and how you get there. And for example, very early days in LinkedIn, I laid out this strategic framework with growth, then engagement, then revenue, where it's like, well, we need to have at least millions of people in the network. That's growth. Then we need to engage them. Then we need to sort of generate revenue in order to continue investing in the business. And the pivot that we essentially made was it took us long enough to get the growth where we had the millions of people. That was when you and I first met. That it's, as opposed to kind of going immediately to engagement, we actually built a few revenue features first because we wanted to have the long-term sustainability of the economics in the platform. And what we're focused on primarily now is engagement. So we kind of went growth, revenue, engagement as kind of a focus on terms of how we drove the business. And the reason why that pivot was necessary is we said, look, this is taking longer time frames. We want to have more substantial money in order to invest in the business, create a sustainable platform. So let's build out some of the revenue features first, which primarily apply to outbound professionals, yes, recruiters and hiring managers, but also salespeople, venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, journalists, and anyone who needs to talk to people they don't know on a weekly basis are the kind of folks who generally engage in LinkedIn's premium features. But now we're back to engagement so as to apply to every professional and everything they do in every day. Not everything they do. Relevance every day.
What do you think is more difficult in the pivoting process? Changing the nature of who you are, whether it's a company or yourself, or changing the perception of others of who you used to be? I mean, here you are. I think about myself and the evolution that I've made. Look, I've always cared deeply about making an impact or a difference in the world, but I have to say that for a long period of time, I was more scarcity-minded and focused on making my business successful. And now that we've done that, I really want to lead in this world with being a mission-driven company, and that's what I want people to think about. However, the history is how I behaved going, up the trajectory of the business is how people perceived me. Your perception of collecting a large number of users versus engagement, what are the risks, and how do you get, or is the more difficult journey just getting it right for yourself, or is the difficult journey fighting the perception?
Well, it's, as you very well know, both are quite hard. And so it's kind of a choice between, hard facet number one, hard facet number two. I think that the key thing in both the substance of the reinvention and also the brand connection, the brand promise, the relationship, and how people perceive you it just takes time, and you have to get it. You have to make sure that one of the things I sketched out very early days in LinkedIn was never have a bad experience. Try to minimize the bad experiences and then build up the more and more positive experiences over time. So, for example, there's many users who go, look, I think LinkedIn's valuable when I'm going to go look for a job, and so I leave it there, and it's a little boring, and I don't really use it very much on a day-to-day basis. And that's because we built up first growth and then a baseline for revenue for outbound professionals or people when they were looking for a job. Now what we're doing is saying, okay, well, here's a set of features that could be useful to you on a daily basis. We essentially have the ability to win people's trust as we do this because we worked really hard to make sure they never had negative experiences in getting to this point. So they might have said, oh, this is interesting, this is valuable for me in the future, not right now, a little boring, I'm going to kind of be here but not really be actively present. And then we'll essentially say, oh, here's some great things for you. And one of the things that we find pretty constantly when people check back into the site, they say, oh, where did all these features come from? I didn't know that you had built all these things. And that's because we're building those up in order to cause people to re-engage over time as that they're doing. And I think the same thing is true for individuals in their careers because the notion maybe is like, look, I spent 10, 20 years focused on building my career, being an executive, making this go, building my business, and now I want to add in other things to it. Well, it's like, all right, well then that's just like any other product or any other company. You need to say, okay, now I begin to layer those things in over time in terms of the relationships that I build, in terms of the activities that I do, in terms of the projects that I succeed in. And I think it's the same challenge.
Yeah. And I can't express more the agreement around never a bad experience.
Yes.
And, relative to a career perspective and entrepreneurs, as you well know, it's so easy at times when you're trying to make your business successful to periodically cut corners or move on when it's not quite working well and you're not sure you're going to get it there, move on to the next. But the ability to stick with anything and continue to pour generosity into the value until everybody perceives that they've had an extraordinary experience. We really can't afford that in our personal lives, in our own personal brands, and we can't afford it in our corporate brands either. That's a great point to everybody to take away.
Yep, and it's one of the things I think you actually have said very well. Part of how you build relationships is by giving, right? Is by starting by saying, look, I view this to be an alliance. Here's something I can help you with and do and work with you, because I'm showing that I view it to both of us to be important. And I think that's actually critical.
Yeah, we've always believed that stepping up and being competitive isn't about satisfaction, it's about excessive generosity. And that's true in our products, and that's true in how we treat people. So, and as we moved on, it's also true of culture, which, by the way, I want to talk a little bit about that for your organization. What's it like to be a part of LinkedIn? When I was getting prepared, I was trying to read some stuff that maybe, you're on my pinging list, so I get articles about you all the time, and I'm always seeing things. But I actually dug something up that I hadn't seen before. It was a quote from you that said, I've also tried to build a culture that understands that writing brief emails is not emotional coldness. I love that, and I know that I am, well, put it this way, if that's true, then people must find me incredibly warm. My emails are not as brief as they should be. Can you tell us a little bit about the culture of the organization, and can you tell me how you balanced what we believe the need for high perceived accountability and candor, but also the need for relational connectivity among a team? What did you build at LinkedIn?
Well, one of the key things is to stay focused on the, this is kind of classic stuff, on getting the work done and customers and so forth, and not get overly distracted by internal meetings, internal dialogue, where, your primary universe very naturally becomes in a company is all of you talking to each other, as opposed to the things that you're doing in the world, things for customers, projects that you're launching, these sorts of things. And so part of the thing is to say, well, how do you keep brief meetings? How do you keep them, on target? How do you leave room for innovation? How do you essentially say, look, the amount of work tends to exponentiate in larger and larger companies just from a process perspective. How do you keep that as thin and light as possible so that you can stay focused on your mission, stay focused on what you're doing for your customers, stay focused on that as the primary goal for why you're being here? And so, for example, the email point was, one of the things that I'd seen in every Silicon Valley culture I've been part of is longer and longer email threads where you kind of like people spending all this time hammering this stuff out through an email thread, and you're like, okay, how do you keep that as compact as possible in order to proceed? Sorry?
My people are laughing in the background. It's embarrassing.
Yeah. And so,
there's something we know too much about.
Yes, and so, one is, part of the thing that we started very early is say, look, don't, use a lot. If you feel like you need to participate, try to participate as focused and brief as possible. So we do this +1, look, I agree with what was just said, and then just that +1. Or I say, this is for discussion, and then I actually use emoticons a lot of times, like a smiley face, to say, look, this is not like, this is for discussion. This is for discussion. Look, we'll get to it, right, as a function. And how do you do that? How do you do standing room only, standing meetings so that you do it as brief as possible? You also do things where you leave aside sometimes even an hour or two of discussion for innovation, for let's talk about the landscape. Let's talk about what's going on. Let's talk about technology trends where, yes, the outputs are ideas posting, but then you have a place for you can bring your idea to that, and we actually talk about it, but then the rest of the time we're focused on time efficiency of getting things done. Anyway, we probably go for hours on this, but those are the kinds of things.
I was just thinking, you're welcome to go for hours. I'm already going to cut this up and use it as a blog in and of itself, so I think it's a fantastic piece, and those kind of how-to nuggets are great. We should start standing up more in our meetings, that's for sure.
Yep.
Talk to me a little bit about, I was just looking for the section in the book, I really thought it was great, around your network literacy. Tell folks a little bit about why that's important and how you define that.
Well, so network literacy, it's funny, I actually gave that in the TED Talk, which I don't think is online yet, but it's not yet in the book, or isn't in the book. It's basically, the fact is, if you take seriously that we live and work in a networked world, that the concept of being able to navigate networks is as fundamental as the concept of literacy. And what that means is an ability to build a relationship, to understand how networks help you solve problems, that when you're solving key challenges, how is it you can deploy your network and maybe a particular subsection or a particular person within a network in order to solve a problem? How do you find the right expertise? How do you find the right information? How do you assemble the right kinds of resources in order to solve a problem? And these are all versions of network literacy. And one of the ones that I gave as an example on the TED stage, as a personal description, is so that how people think about how I do this, is when I do investments, I actually don't formulate an investment thesis and then go look for, say, for example, mobile gaming. I formulate here's where I think the interesting activity is, and then I go get close to the nodes in that network so the investments can find me. And that's part of having of network thinking, doing investments, as opposed to saying, oh, what I'm going to go do is I'm going to go search all the different kind of classifieds for a job. As opposed to it, I'm going to go talk to a couple of people who are the key people who know what's going on in an industry and say, well, look, what are the interesting opportunities? What are the ways to invest in myself? Again, these are kind of instances of network thinking, and you need that in order to be network literate.
Can you talk a little bit more about the process of how around that? Because you're so good in the book in bringing tactics to the forefront, which is why I think people are going to just consume it. When you go out to be curious, to interrogate these nodes,
yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that process? How do you approach them? What kind of questions are you asking? And what are you doing with that data?
Well, so part of what is really important in terms of how you build the relationships is making sure that everyone understands that it's an alliance, that it matters to both of you. And so, part of the tactics we go through are what are the kinds of things like don't start with an ask, make it, authenticity obviously is all very important in connection. It's not just, oh, what can you do for me? It's how are we allies together? And part of that is to then also think about, what are the kinds of things that you can bring to the relationship, bring to the party. And, we covered a bunch of different kind of circumstances, kind of classic objections that people have. They say, well, if I'm just a college student and I have an opportunity to build a connection with Bill Gates, what do I possibly have? Well, the answer is you have the location where you are. It's like, by the way, here's an analysis of what's going on in the college market. Maybe this is useful to the foundation or to Microsoft or something. And then at the very least, you're showing that you believe that it's a bi-directional relationship, that you need to be providing value to the other person as well as, it's an alliance, as well as it flows in both directions. And so, for me, part of that's been that, when I sit down with folks, I try to make sure that I always add something to the problems they're trying to solve. So, for example, every single time I meet with an entrepreneur, one of the questions that I always get to is, how can I help you? And that's, obviously one of the things they're frequently looking for is investment, and sometimes it plays out or not, but sometimes they say, well, I'm looking for a connection to Apple. How do I get into the Apple developer circuit? Or do you know what's going on with, the evolution of, the Android platform, or what's going on in terms of how I should think about the smartphone revolution? And you try to add something into their life. And then similarly, whenever I meet somebody, whether I know them well or even know, I try to figure out what do they know that I don't know. Because one of the things that people love to do is say, look, here is something that's potentially useful. So I always ask questions. I always say, oh, so, you've been, working at Walmart for the last 10 years. What did you find was the most surprising things that you learned in the last couple of years in terms of operational efficiency? Or what do you think is unique about the Walmart perspective in the world that may be useful to know? And then that gives a chance to say, oh, this is genuine. This is not just Reid lecturing at me about what I know about smartphones, but it's also like, oh, I'm interested in knowing what you know as well. And these are all important parts of kind of genuine, relationship building and
in our words, we always talk about 3 levels of currency or generosity. Universal currency is being that kind of authentic individual, that curious person, the individual that actually is interested in developing some level of intimacy or connection. Professional currency is really what's going on in your career and your professional life and how can I advance that in whatever way possible. Personal currency gets to the point where you have a permission to find out how you can really be impactful to that person, whether it's in giving back to the community, their family, etc. And I think giving people that kind of a model is very helpful. I don't want to leave to the Q&A without getting a chance for people to have this level of connectivity to somebody they read about all the time and on the cover of magazines. 2 questions. One's a very tactical one. How do you use LinkedIn for your networking and your building of relationships that you think we can learn from? Like, what are one of the 2 or the things that you do that all of us could be more effective at?
So let's see. Say 3 things quickly, and we can go into any level of depth. So one is, even though I know a number of highly expert people, I never presume that I know all of the experts on a specific topic. So, for example, when I'm looking for something like, okay, who really knows in terms of what's going on, what the next generation of phones will be, is I don't just go, well, yeah, I know 2 or 3 people, I'll call them. I do that too, but I also look for, okay, who are the additional, particular experts that would be useful 2 and 3 degrees out. It's simple math. If each of you, if you know, 1,000 people and each of them know 1,000 people, the likelihood that there's a really good expert 2 degrees out there is very, very high, right, for any particular problem. Second thing is that I make sure that part of the deal that I work with when I'm working with the people I know is I say, look, I want to connect you with the right people that are helpful to you. I don't have the time always to think about who those are. So one of the things that LinkedIn gives you is to search and say, hey, do you think, for example, that I should talk about how do I manage, say, for example, the new world of relationship marketing with Keith? I'll say, oh, absolutely. Here's how I would connect to him. And if it was it was a senior level person, I'd say, look, I'd connect you to Keith directly. If it was a person who was kind of like, an early level person in their organization, I'd say, oh, here, let me connect you to one of Keith's people, right? Because that's the right way to do this. And then as opposed to me having in my head, which I can't do, all of different things they're doing day by day, they say, oh, would so-and-so be the right person for me to contact, and then I can help direct them the right way. And then the third one is I always think about how do I essentially occasion serendipity. So, for example, when people, and this is not as well built into LinkedIn yet, obviously perhaps a future feature, although I don't think we have anything in the near-term current plans. But, for example, when someone says, you should just really meet so-and-so, so-and-so's a great person, and I really trust that person, I always do it, right? Yep. A phone call, a breakfast, a coffee, whatever it is. And some of the best relationships I've made over time have been literally, one guy told me, hey, I was having coffee with a friend of mine in New York. He said, oh, did you ever meet John Lilly? And I was like, no, I don't even know who John Lilly is. He's like, all right. John and you think exactly like you should meet John. Here, and he provided an email introduction. I had breakfast with John, and since then, John became the CEO of Mozilla. I joined the board because of that. When John left Mozilla, he's now partner at Greylock. Those are the kinds of things where you have to occasion serendipity. Now, it's not randomness. It's not stop the person at the grocery store and say, let's you and I spend an hour together. But directed from the people that you know in your network where the reference of, oh, so-and-so is great. And by the way, that's a great question to ask people is, who do you think the best person for me to meet would be, right? And sometimes you'll get just, gold is too weak of a term for the relationships that you build because of that.
On a less tactical level and maybe on a more introspective level, if you think about your relationships today, what do you at this stage of your life need more or less of relative to the people in your life? We've gone through stages in both of our lives both of us have met at places and conferences that we no longer attend. You've created entire events that are anti-events that you used to attend. Just because your own stage in life has evolved and what you're looking for. What do you need to dial up and dial down relative to people and relationships in your life today?
Well, I'd say the thing I need to dial down, I need to dial up is focus in terms of getting certain projects. Because I find that I'm kind of divided in too many different directions. And so the thing that I'm working towards is how do I work on essentially a smaller number of fewer projects, and that's kind of both dial down and dial up. So in terms of people, it kind of comes to refactoring to the folks that I'm working on those projects with now. That doesn't mean that if someone I kind of I spend less time with today, doesn't mean I won't spend more time with them in a couple years, but it's kind of a focus on these projects right now. And then, kind of similarly, it kind of comes down to not holding on to these old projects. You have to make kind of decisive decisions about, like, okay, this project has really been meaningful to me. It's something that's really important to me, but I think it's time for me to move away from it at least for a while, right, in order to refocus on what I'm doing. And that's perhaps, a little too abstract, but that is definitely the need.
Well, look, I think all of us in our lives, if we could step back and shuffle through the complexity of our lives and focus on a few key things. And I have to say that, having a new 14-year-old in my house has mandated that, and also increased a great deal of empathy for a lot of my community who in the past had said, how do you find the time for all of this? So the answer really is you begin to you use the art of curation with the people as well as the time. Yeah.
And when it means that you move, Keith, this is one thing I think.
In the meantime, Sarah, get teed up.
Yeah. When it means that, like for example, when you move away from someone at a time point, it's not a question of disliking them or disrespecting or anything else. It's just a refocus on what everyone's priorities are, and I think it can be done with humanity and grace.
And I think I'll add two more words: humility and vulnerability.
Yes.
Humanity and grace, humility, vulnerability. To let somebody know that you're, and I don't mind this. Look, if you're walking away from a relationship because you're pissed off, I generally tell people it's not a very good idea to vent at that point of time, unless you're at the stage of empathy and understanding, et cetera, but you don't want to burn those bridges. On the other hand, if you're moving away from individuals because of focus, I think that the angst with which you came to that conclusion and all of the personal and professional challenges that are burdening you at this stage, it's not a bad time if somebody is feeling it to let them know why you have to move away, why you're not returning their calls as frequently. Conflict avoidance or avoidance of that transparency, I think, is a bad idea. But people will empathize when you say, well, heck, listen, I've got a 14-year-old who's challenging right now in my life. I've got two new projects with this company and this company that are so impactful. I really have to focus here, and I apologize, and it was difficult for me to come to that conclusion, but, join me for a workout someday that I'm already doing it, or something. So, create some opportunity that's a blended opportunity instead of a standalone. Sarah, are you ready to go to some questions? Yep. I'm only assuming we've got a ton of them.
Yep, we do, absolutely. So the first one is from Dimitri, who's calling in from Russia, and I wanted to do his question first because he was here very early and got questions in the queue. He'd like to know, essentially, how do you diversify your network? He wants to expand the range of kinds of people that he can contact. And actually, that's a question for either or both Keith and Reid.
Well, I'll say something quickly, briefly. The principal way, there's kind of two ways that I think you can diversify your network. One is to go to kind of different kinds of events, and kind of things that are afield. Like it could be charity things, it could be a different kind of industry conference, it could be other kinds of things. And obviously, you have to be a little experimental because you don't know which of these will work, and so there'll be some that don't work at all. The second thing is to go to the network you already have and ask them who are the most kind of diverse and interesting people that they know, right? And then go build a relationship, see if it works for both of you with them. Because at that point, because the way you look at networks is they're nodes, and at that place, there are folks who are nodes to entirely different networks. And I'll give as one last small example on this is sometimes the principal way that I go to a new event is I go to the couple of folks that I know there, and then I meet the folks that they know, right? As a function of kind of of beginning to branch out from from some of the folks to entirely new networks.
Yeah. And then, by the way, Sarah, grab Dimitri's personal information. There's a Dimitri I'm going to be sharing the stage with in Moscow on July 2nd, and I'm not sure if that's the same Dimitri that's dialed in. But if it isn't, but if it isn't, then I'd welcome Dimitri. Any recommendations of great restaurants in Moscow, if you don't mind, I'd appreciate that.
Privately message us, Dimitri. Yeah, the next question is from Michael Mostoff, and it's actually a variation on a question that we get all the time. It may be the most popular question, not just about networking, but especially about how to use LinkedIn. He specifically is an attorney who's in the process of changing careers. He wants to shift into venture capitalism. He doesn't, however, know very many people in the VC industry. So he wants to know how to leverage his LinkedIn network to connect to people in the VC industry. But I also think it's a good question broadly. How do you make that shift?
Yep. Well, a little bit of the earlier connections, whereby you essentially, you kind of talk to some folks who then introduce you to others. I mean, for example, the way that I first connected to VCs when I got back from Oxford to the Silicon Valley was I went and talked to actually family and friends who then connected me to, for example, lawyers who then were working with VCs, who then connected me to VCs, by which I began to understand how the kind of the Silicon Valley venture and entrepreneurial ecosystem worked and that sort of thing. Now, getting into venture capital specifically is a very difficult kind of transition because, generally speaking, venture capital is much more like a cottage industry than an asset class. And the only way that you end up usually connecting into a venture firm from a perspective of working there is to have a very close relationship with one or more of the partners, usually, although not always, by being in one of the portfolio companies. Because then that gives both you and them years of working with each other, and joining any kind of partnership, including a venture capital partnership, is vaguely akin to marriage. And so it tends to be that you need to have a fair amount of time knowing each other before that actually joining a partnership works. And so the secondary recommendation would be is go work in venture ecosystem kinds of things, like be a GC at a startup company, these kinds of things, as ways to get connected into those folks and begin to build those relationships.
Yeah. I'd add one more thing, which is, again, understanding the currency of the VC world. And I'm not a VC person, but I would imagine that there are probably opportunities once you've developed enough of a relationship, shown yourself to be on top of things, to do free projects on the side. If you got a meeting with a VC
Yep.
and said, what space are you most interested in but you haven't begun to explore, I'd like to go spend the next month or two studying that space and coming back and presenting something to you. I had a meeting last week with the former chairman of Goldman Sachs, and you couldn't imagine anybody who probably has anything he wants, right? And this is a man who is all about New York, knows everybody and probably in the world. And at the very end of the meeting, I said, "This has been extraordinarily valuable to me. Thank you so much for this discussion." We were talking about my foundation. I said, how long is your to-do list right now? And he said, well, it's interesting you say that. I just looked at it, and there's about 28 big things I need to be working on right now, and I was working on that list last week. And I said, would you do me the biggest favor in the world and pick one thing on that list which you think I could add any value to, and please give me an assignment, because I would love the ability to come back here again. And I don't feel like I, frankly, have earned that right until I am able to be of greater service to you. You've given me so much time. And he said, well, how about this? Will you stick around for the next hour? I've got a foundation meeting that's happening. stick with me, and I'll give you a ton of things to do. And so obviously be careful what you ask for. And I'm glad that I did, because it was an extraordinary thing, and he and I have spoken 5 times since. So no matter who somebody is, you can find ways to add value to that person.
Yep.
Sarah, next question.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions, and this is actually another thing that comes up frequently. Questions about Lions, or LinkedIn open networkers. That's people, for anyone who doesn't know, who accept requests from anyone in LinkedIn, as opposed to kind of guarding who's within their network. Do you guys have opinions on that? Reid, do you think that's the best way to use LinkedIn, or expand?
Well, so the short answer is that the design architecture of LinkedIn is to have a set of folks that you're connected to be the folks that you know each other. So the rough design principle is that the people you're connected to you know well enough to refer to other people that you know on a case-by-case basis based on how you know them. And so it's kind of off the design architecture for LinkedIn. Now, we tend to also espouse a lot of individual freedom. So if a group of people say, hey, we all want to be connected to each other, and even though we don't know each other and that's how we want to operate, we don't stop them from doing that. We do make sure that other folks don't feel that they are, overly solicited or spammed or anything else because of that. We try to limit that as much as we can. But the idea is that actually your network is based on one of relationships, trust, knowledge, that you help and collaborate each other this way. And so it's based on your connections are the folks that you're supposed to know that way. Now, we have a variety of group products by which people can go into groups and say, hey, we're all in this group together because we care about this thing together and we don't necessarily know each other. And that's one of the ways that we try to do that. And that's, I suppose, is the high line of how LinkedIn thinks about, so-called open networking.
So when somebody reads this book and reaches out to you and comments how you've changed their life, how they applied the principles, and here are the results that they've gained, and how impactful you've been to them, and they ask to connect to you on LinkedIn, the answer is no, because you don't yet know them?
No, because I don't know them. Maybe we will meet at some point. And by the way, there is a group on LinkedIn about the book for people to connect and share tips and other kinds of things that can further elaborate and help. And I actually participate in that group. But it's like if they said then, okay, could I please meet Keith? I'd say, well, I don't know how to introduce you, right? This person read my book. That's great, but that's not enough to take one of my friends' time because I don't have enough information to provide the reference. Sometimes, by the way, it's only 30 or 60 minutes of meeting someone at a conference that's enough that you begin to go, okay, now I know.
And I will connect with somebody if I meet them at an event, even if it's briefly, if I get the context. I will even do it if I've been conducting a virtual relationship back and forth with emails. But I do have to say that in the early stage, I had to really go through a restart process with my LinkedIn because I was overwhelmed with the number of people who were reaching out to me with heartfelt stories, and I have to say that I was too aggressive in my connection. So I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and I think you should keep the network pure. Sarah, any other questions? I wanted to see if we give the ability for anybody in the room here as well to use the trump card of being a part of the Ferrazzi family. So raise your hand if you got a question.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll ask another one in the meantime. I think this is a great one. It comes from the startup world, but I think it really applies to anyone who is developing a business or a product, a business around a product or a service. The question is, how can you leverage LinkedIn to seek potential customer feedback on products while you're still in the ideation phase?
Well, that's actually fairly straightforward. Just find folks who would be the prospective customers. Reach out to them, preferably by reference, but not always. This is part of when it's useful to be a subscriber to sometimes reach out to them and say, look, I'm thinking about building a product of this following sort. Could I talk to you, or could I meet with you? And I'd be really interested in your feedback of would this product work for you and these sorts of things. And some people will say no. They'll say no more often when it's a cold call. They'll say no less often when it's a reference, hence the preference for references. But then part of the reason why people are interested in this is they're interested in what you might be building and how it might be useful to them and these sorts of things. And so then, and you should go meet with as many of these folks as you can because that will help give you the intuition. And you should listen very carefully. So, for example, too often when people do this, they tend to say things like, "So, how much do you like my product?" And then that kind of social gesture is the person goes, "Oh, I guess it's fine, good," Whereas the real relevant question is, what do you think is really missing? Do you think this is really a game-changing product? Like really enable them to give you the negative feedback so that you can refine, because this is a central part of the entrepreneurial process is called failing fast, and that's not to fail, that's to succeed in the long term. And so you want to discover what the points of failure are even before you start building so that you can reformulate your plan in order to succeed.
And again, let's not forget how crucial that is. I just want to punctuate that for us as individuals. Every leader should have at some point asked for that 360 anonymous, safe feedback. And if you really have the courage and authenticity, you should take those, the simple question I asked of my team a number of years ago was, tell me, what am I doing as a leader that's holding us back from success, and what do you need more for me to do to make you more successful? And I got an absolute earful, and I read the results out to the group, and I refused to debate them. I just considered each one thoughtfully within the context of the team. And can we do that with our friends? Can we do that with our network? Can you do that with your employers? That feedback loop is so crucial, and I know you believe strongly about it as you write. I do want to shift, actually. I loved the book relative to the invest in yourself portions. You're so practical. So what can you do this week, next week, tomorrow, etc.? I love that. We believe in it strongly in our myGreenlight that I talked to you about, our mission-based learning platform. Can you leave us with 3 missions? We're sort of bumping up against the end of the time, and I couldn't think of anything better than to be given by Reid Hoffman 3 things that everybody on this call should go do as we leave this call today and tomorrow.
It's funny. It's a little challenging to do generally because it depends a little bit on what people are trying to do. But I would say the first would be to do kind of a network inventory, which is who are the folks that are actually particularly important, to you and what you're doing, and have you been in touch with them, right? Have you prioritized based on importance rather than reactivity? And then reconnect, obviously, with folks who are high importance that you haven't been in touch with, and to make that go. I'd say the second thing is to think clearly about what are the things. Like if you were I always think about strategy as kind of 2-step. Like there's here's where I want to be. Now, what are the intermediate steps to where I want to be? So what are the key things that would be useful? It could be people in a network. It could be a certain skill. It could be a piece of experience, like volunteering for work, like you were mentioning earlier, about the right things in order to make something happen. And then say, what is one of those key intermediate steps that I could move to in the next couple weeks, in the next couple months? Like, what's the thing that I could do that would help me get to my long-term future in terms of where do I want to be? And then I guess the last thing I'd say is say, okay, what are the ways that I could, what are the things that I could do that make my network better, right? E.g., not like how do I expand it and everything else, but like what are the things that I could add into it? Like who are key people that I could provide introductions to? What are key, like, oh, here's something, like here's an event you should go to. I know you would really like this event. And think a little bit about the folks around you, because this will lead to a lot of really good serendipity. And I think those would be the 3 missions that I would, as a general purpose across everyone, say.
Well, look, great pieces of advice. A quick summary to that for everybody. If you've got a goal, a dream, figure out what the short-term increments of that goal and dream are, and then ask the question, who? Who are the people that I need to begin to build relationships with, past, present, or future, around the next 18 months that are so critical to that goal and the dream? And then, figure out how to make them more successful. Figure out what currency you bring to the table. Reid, I'm always struck, as a person who has spent the last 10 years professionally in the exact same space as you, doing nothing more than talking about this, I'm always truly humbled by your insight, how quick, how sharp you are, but at the same time, so much admire your authenticity, your care, your approachability. You're a wonderful man and a friend, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. And thank you so much for giving this to our community.
Very humbling, and all of that goes for you too. Thank you.
Take care, my friend. Bye-bye.
You too.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please go to www.thestartupofyou.com and check out Reid's book. It's wonderful, and we really appreciate you being here today.